Daniel had always believed that a quiet life was enough for him. He lived on the edge of a small rural town, where most days passed slowly, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. His world was simple: waking early, feeding the horses, cleaning the stables, tending the fields, and ending the day with the same peaceful silence. People in the town respected him for his calm nature, and although he didn't talk much, he was known as someone who never turned away a person or an animal in need. One cold evening in early winter, when the sky was dark even before dinner time, Daniel walked toward his stable carrying a small lantern. The wind was sharp, and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost. The horses were restless that night, stamping their hooves against the wooden floor. Daniel thought maybe the cold was bothering them, or maybe a wild animal had passed nearby. But as he stepped inside, the sound he heard wasn't from the horses. There was the softest breath, like someone sleeping. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. There, beside River, his calmest and most loyal horse, lay a woman, curled up on the hay. She was wrapped in a thin shawl that didn't look warm enough for the cold night. Her hair was messy, her dress wrinkled, and her hands were trembling even in her sleep. She rested her head on River's side as if the animal had given her a feeling of safety. River, surprisingly, stood completely still, allowing her to stay beside him. Daniel stood frozen for a moment. It was not every day he found a stranger sleeping beside his horse. He gently set the lantern down and stepped closer, careful not to frighten her or disturb River. The stable was quiet except for the horse's slow breathing and the faint sound of the wind outside. He bent down slightly and spoke in a calm voice. "Are you all right?" The woman opened her eyes slowly, not startled but tired, so tired that it looked like she hadn't slept well in weeks. She sat up, pulling the shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes were red, perhaps from crying, and her face carried the kind of sadness that didn't come from just one bad day, but from something long and painful. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. I didn't mean to intrude." Daniel shook his head gently. "You're not in trouble. I just want to know if you're safe." The woman looked down at her hands, avoiding his eyes. She seemed unsure of what to say. Instead of speaking, she reached out and touched River's neck lightly, as if seeking comfort from him instead of Daniel. The horse lowered his head toward her hand, responding in a way he rarely did with strangers. "I had nowhere else to go," she finally said. Her words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Daniel didn't ask questions. He could see in her eyes that she didn't want to explain more, not now, maybe not ever. He also knew that if someone ended up in his stable seeking warmth beside a horse, they must be going through something painful. "You can rest here for a bit," he said gently. "It's warm, and River doesn't seem to mind." The woman nodded without looking at him. She pulled her shawl tighter around her and leaned back against the hay. River, surprisingly, shifted just slightly, giving her a little more space. Daniel watched the scene quietly, trying to understand how a complete stranger had created such a calm connection with his horse. After a few moments, Daniel asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering. "Sarah." It was a simple name, but her voice trembled when she said it, as if even introducing herself felt difficult. Daniel offered her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm Daniel," he said. "If you need water or something warm, you can come inside the house. I live just a few steps away." Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. This is fine." Her refusal wasn't rude. It was fearful, like someone who didn't want to burden anyone or get too close. Daniel respected that. He had seen people carry heavy grief before, and he recognized the distance in her eyes, the distance people kept when they were afraid their sadness might spill out if someone showed them too much kindness. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the horses shifting softly in their stalls filled the silence. Daniel took a step back, planning to leave her to rest. But something made him pause. He saw Sarah gently place her hand on River's neck again. Her fingers moved slowly, brushing through the horse's mane, and then she leaned her head near him. She whispered something. A name. Daniel could not fully hear it, but the way she spoke it made his heart tighten. It was a name spoken with love, pain, and longing. A name that didn't belong to a stranger but to someone she had lost, or someone she was searching for. River's ears twitched, as if he recognized something in her voice. The horse's reaction unsettled Daniel. River rarely reacted to anyone except Daniel himself. Yet here he was, standing still and silent, for a woman he had never seen before. Sarah closed her eyes again, leaning gently against the hay. Daniel didn't disturb her. He picked up his lantern, gave River a small pat on the side, and whispered to the horse, "Take care of her." Before leaving the stable, he glanced back once more. Sarah had already drifted into sleep again, her face peaceful but worn by grief. River kept his head lowered, as if watching over her. Daniel stepped out into the cold night with 100 questions in his mind, but he knew better than to demand answers. Life in the countryside had taught him one important lesson. Some stories revealed themselves slowly, only when the heart was ready, and he could feel it deeply even in this short, quiet moment that Sarah carried a story heavy enough to break anyone's world apart. But he didn't know yet that the name she whispered would soon break his. The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise, as he always did. The world outside was still quiet, covered in a faint mist that made the air colder than usual. He pulled on his boots, wrapped a warm scarf around his neck, and walked toward the stable, wondering if Sarah would still be there. A part of him hoped she was. Not because he wanted to question her, but because he felt something unusual the night before. Something he couldn't quite explain. When he reached the stable doorway, he paused. Through the faint light of dawn, he saw Sarah sitting beside River again. She wasn't sleeping this time. Instead, she was talking softly to the horse, her voice gentle like a lullaby. River stood with his head lowered, listening to her as if he understood every word. Daniel stepped inside quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever fragile moment was happening between them. But Sarah noticed him and quickly wiped her eyes, as if hiding tears. "Good morning," Daniel said softly. She nodded. "Good morning." There was an awkward silence at first. The kind that hangs between two people who don't know each other well, but feel something connecting them anyway. Daniel didn't want to make her uncomfortable, so he went about his usual tasks. He fed the horses, checked their water, and brushed their coats. While he worked, he kept noticing Sarah's eyes following River calmly, as though being near the horse helped her breathe easier. After a few minutes, Daniel finally asked, "Did you sleep well enough?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Better than I have in a long time." Her voice carried a truth that didn't need explaining. Anyone could hear the exhaustion behind it. Daniel felt a small sense of relief. Maybe the stable had given her some peace, even if only for a few hours. He tried to offer her breakfast, but she shook her head again. "I'm all right," she insisted, though her tired face suggested otherwise. Daniel didn't push her. Instead, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need. This place is quiet." Sarah looked down, her fingers gently brushing River's mane. "Thank you," she whispered, as if unaccustomed to kindness. Throughout the day, Sarah stayed close to the stable. She sat on an old wooden stool or on the hay, sometimes talking softly to River, sometimes staring into the distance with a sad, faraway look in her eyes. Daniel noticed that she rarely smiled, but when she touched the horse, something in her face relaxed as though the warmth of the animal eased the weight she carried. By midday, Daniel found her standing at the fence watching him work with the other horses. He was training a younger horse that was stubborn and restless. Daniel moved slowly, patiently guiding the animal without force. Sarah watched silently, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. "You're good with them," she said quietly when he approached to check on her. Daniel smiled a bit. Horses understand honesty. If you're calm, they respond. If you're harsh, they shut down. Sarah looked down, and Daniel noticed the meaning behind her silence. She seemed like someone who had faced too much harshness, too much fear, too many heavy days that pushed her spirit down. After a long pause, she whispered, "My husband used to say the same thing." Daniel stopped. It was the first time she mentioned someone personally. He waited, giving her room to continue if she wanted. She didn't. She simply walked back to River and placed her hand on the horse's neck again. It was clear that sharing even that small detail had cost her a lot. Over the next few days, this pattern continued. Sarah came to the stable early, stayed close to River, and left only when the sun began to lower. She never asked for food or help, never talked much, but she returned again and again, as if the stable was the only place she felt safe. Daniel didn't try to ask about her past. He sensed asking would push her away. Instead, he offered simple comforts: warm water, a blanket, a place to sit, and slowly, very slowly, Sarah began to open the smallest parts of her story without even realizing it. One afternoon, while brushing River, Sarah spoke softly. "My husband loved horses. He said they had the purest souls." Daniel stayed quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. "He used to sit for hours with our horse back home. The world felt quieter for him there." Her voice trembled slightly. Daniel realized she wasn't just speaking about someone she lost, she was speaking about someone she deeply loved. "He sounds like a good man," Daniel said gently. She nodded. He was. More than people understood. There was something about the way she said it, something that hinted at a deeper pain, something she wasn't ready to share. Over time, Daniel also began noticing something unusual. River responded to Sarah in ways he didn't with others. Whenever she entered the stable, River turned his head toward her immediately, even if he was eating or resting. If she spoke, he flicked his ears forward, as if recognizing her voice. If she cried silently, he nudged her arm gently, trying to comfort her. Daniel had worked with horses all his life, but even he couldn't explain the connection forming between Sarah and River. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Daniel entered the stable to check the horses before closing for the night. To his surprise, he found Sarah again asleep beside River, just like the first night. She was curled up in the hay, her hand resting lightly on the horse's leg. Daniel stepped closer, planning to gently wake her so she could go somewhere warmer. But before he reached her, he heard her whisper something in her sleep. It was the same name he had heard faintly on the first night. Only this time, the stable was quiet enough that he heard it clearly, and hearing it made his blood run cold. Sarah whispered the name with so much pain that it pierced the air around her. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. That name. It was a name Daniel had not heard in years, a name he had buried deep in his heart, a name connected to a person who had disappeared from his life without explanation, leaving behind a silence that hurt Daniel more than any physical wound ever could. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he took a step back. The lantern light flickered on the wooden walls, casting long shadows that made the moment feel even heavier. He stared at Sarah in disbelief, trying to make sense of what he just heard. Why was she whispering that name? How did she know it? Who was she really? And what connection did she have to the person whose name still haunted Daniel's memories? River lowered his head toward her again, as if guarding her, as if he understood everything Daniel didn't. Daniel stood in the stable doorway for a long time, unable to move, unable to understand why fate had brought this woman into his quiet life. He didn't know the truth yet. He didn't know how deeply her story would touch his own. He didn't know that the name she whispered would soon break his world apart. But he felt it like a soft echo in his chest that everything in his life was about to change, and none of it would be simple. Daniel could not sleep that night. He lay awake in his small room, staring at the wooden ceiling above him, replaying the moment when Sarah whispered that name. It echoed again and again in his ears, as if the walls themselves were repeating it. He tried to push it away, tried to believe he had misheard, but the truth kept rising inside him, like a tide he could not stop. The name she spoke was Michael. Daniel's heart tightened every time the memory surfaced. Michael was not just a name. He was Daniel's younger brother, a person Daniel had once loved more than anything in the world. They had grown up together, learned together, and even dreamed together. And then one day, without warning, Michael had left. No note, no explanation, no message. He simply vanished from Daniel's life, leaving behind silence and a wound that had never fully healed. For years, Daniel had tried to understand why. Had he done something wrong? Had Michael been unhappy? Had there been something he wanted to tell him but couldn't? Daniel had replayed their last conversation hundreds of times in his mind, searching for clues. But he never found answers. And now, suddenly, a stranger, a grieving widow, was whispering his brother's name in her sleep. Daniel's thoughts were restless. Sarah didn't seem like someone who would lie. She didn't seem like someone who would appear in his stable by accident, and River's strange reaction to her. It was as if the horse recognized something about her. Something deep and familiar. As the night moved slowly toward morning, Daniel made a quiet decision. He needed to know. He needed to understand why she knew Michael's name. He needed to hear her story not out of anger, but out of a desperate longing that had lived inside him for too long. But he also knew he had to approach her carefully. Sarah was fragile, and whatever she carried inside her was heavy. He couldn't force her to speak. He had to let the truth come gently. When the first light of dawn entered the sky, Daniel got up, put on his boots, and walked to the stable. The air was cold, carrying the smell of damp earth and hay. He stepped softly inside and found Sarah sitting beside River again, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was awake but looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes and a distant look clouding her face. "Good morning," Daniel said quietly. She looked up at him, forcing a small smile. "Morning?" Daniel didn't know how to begin. He didn't want to frighten her, so he started with something simple. "River seems to like you," he said, trying to sound calm. Sarah looked at the horse lovingly. "He reminds me of someone," she whispered. Daniel's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "Someone important?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, very important." Daniel wanted to ask more, but he waited. He knew she needed to speak on her own, in her own time. He moved closer, grabbed a bucket, and filled it with fresh water for the horses. Sarah watched him for a moment, then lowered her gaze again. The silence felt heavy, full of things unsaid. After a while, Sarah stood up slowly, brushing hay from her clothes. "I should go today," she said softly. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Daniel replied immediately. "You can stay here as long as you need." Sarah shook her head. "I've already stayed too long." "Sarah," Daniel said gently, "you don't have to leave because of fear." "Sarah," she froze. The word fear struck her like a sudden wind. Her eyes softened, then filled with something Daniel couldn't fully read. Sadness, maybe, or something deeper. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly, "but I'm afraid of what I'll remember if I stay." Those words hit Daniel harder than he expected. What memories was she carrying that were so heavy they made her want to run? And how was Michael connected to them? Finally, he decided to ask softly, carefully. "Last night," he began, "you whispered a name." Sarah's entire body stiffened, as if the air around her had suddenly turned cold. She didn't look at him. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. Daniel continued, "You said the name Michael." A shiver ran through Sarah, so visible that even River reacted, stepping closer to her with gentle concern. Daniel softened his voice. "Sarah, who is Michael to you?" For a long time, Sarah didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly, gripping the shawl tightly, as if trying to hold herself together. Daniel wanted to reach out, to tell her she didn't have to say anything if it hurt too much, but he waited. Finally, she whispered, "Michael was my husband." The words fell like stones inside Daniel's chest. His breath caught, and for a moment, he forgot how to move, how to think. He had expected a connection, but not this. His brother had been her husband, his lost brother, the man who had disappeared from his life without explanation. He swallowed hard. "Your husband was named Michael?" "No," she nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, Michael Hayes." Daniel's heart pounded. That was his brother's full name. He felt the world tilt around him. He never told me, Daniel whispered, unable to finish the sentence. He didn't know what he was trying to say. Maybe he didn't even understand what he was feeling. Shock, pain, relief, confusion, they all collided inside him at once. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him for the first time since he asked the question. When she saw the expression on his face, she understood. "You knew him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, struggling to speak. "He was my brother." Sarah's breath left her in a sharp gasp. She stepped back slightly, covering her mouth with her hand. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "He never told me his brother's name. He only said he had someone he cared about but couldn't face." Daniel felt the words hit him like a wave. Couldn't face. The idea stung deeply. "He left suddenly," Daniel said quietly. "I never knew why." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't leave because of you. He left because he felt he wasn't good enough. He thought he would only bring pain to the people he loved." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "But he never told me that." "He was proud," Sarah whispered. "Too proud to show his struggles. Too proud to let you see him hurting." Daniel felt a sting in his chest. All this time, he had believed Michael left because he wanted to. But the truth was different, so much heavier, so much sadder. Sarah continued softly. "He tried to come back. Before he died." Those words made Daniel's world blur. "He was coming back?" "Yes," she said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "He told me he wanted to make things right with you. He said he carried the guilt for years. But then the accident happened." She paused, her voice breaking. "And he never made it home. Tromberleader." Daniel closed his eyes, fighting back tears. For years, he had carried anger, confusion, and hurt. And now he learned that Michael had carried guilt, love, and hope. They had both suffered in silence, separated by misunderstandings and the weight of unspoken feelings. Sarah reached out slightly, not touching him but offering comfort through her presence. "I loved him," she whispered, "and losing him broke me. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do with the memories." Daniel nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "He was my brother. I never stopped looking for him." The stable was quiet, holding their pain gently. River stepped closer to Sarah and Daniel, as if sensing the truth finally being spoken. His calm presence filled the space with a soft kind of comfort. Sarah looked at River with teary eyes. "This horse reminds me of him, of the way he found peace with animals. That's why I came here that night. I didn't know why, just felt drawn here. And when I saw River, it felt like Michael was near." Daniel looked at the horse too. It suddenly made sense. River had once been trained by Michael, years ago, before he left. River's gentle reactions to Sarah were not random. They were echoes of memories, of familiar words, of the same hands that once cared for him. Everything connected like pieces of a puzzle Daniel never expected to solve. The truth broke his world, but it also opened a door to healing. The stable felt different after the truth came out. It was no longer just a place where Sarah sought shelter, or where Daniel worked every day. Now it held something more, something fragile and heavy at the same time. It held memories of Michael, the man who connected them in a way neither had expected. Sarah and Daniel stood quietly for a long time after their painful conversation. The air between them was filled with emotions they were both trying to understand. Sarah held her shawl tightly, her eyes red from crying. Daniel stood with stiff shoulders, trying hard to control the storm inside him. River moved closer to them again, lowering his head gently, as if trying to remind them that they weren't alone. Sarah placed her hand on the horse's neck, and Daniel watched the small moment with a soft ache in his chest. Michael had once stood in this same stable, touching this same horse, and now Sarah stood here, like a final piece of a story Daniel never knew. After a while, Daniel finally spoke. "Thank you for telling me." His voice was low but steady. Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of guilt. "I didn't come here to bring pain to your life. I didn't even know this place existed until that night. I was just lost. I was following a feeling, something I couldn't explain. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe you came here because Michael wanted you to. Maybe he wanted both of us to know the truth. None. Sarah's lips trembled. I wish I could have brought you better memories. But all I have left are pieces of him. Daniel took a deep breath. Pieces are enough. They stood in silence again. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like they were both grieving in their own way with someone who understood the weight of their loss. The sun began to rise higher in the sky, and a soft golden light entered the stable. It warmed the walls and touched Sarah's face gently, making her look less tired, less broken. Daniel watched her closely and realized something important. She had lost her home, her husband, and her sense of direction. She had been wandering alone, carrying memories too heavy for one person. And yet, she found her way to this place. To River, to him. You can stay here, Daniel said finally. Not just for a night. Not just because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because you don't have to run anymore. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, as if she had not expected such kindness. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered. You aren't, Daniel replied gently. This place is big enough for both of us. And I think we both need healing. Sarah looked away, her eyes filling again. I don't know how to start over, she admitted. Everything in my life ended so suddenly. Sometimes I wake up and forget I'm alone. Then it hits me all over again. Daniel stepped a little closer. You are not alone here. His words were simple, but they carried something warm, something Sarah hadn't felt in a long time. For the next few days, Sarah stayed at the ranch. She helped with small tasks like brushing River, carrying water buckets, or sweeping the stable floor. She was quiet most of the time, but her heart seemed to grow a little lighter each day. Daniel noticed she smiled, sometimes small, gentle smiles that came unexpectedly when River nudged her or when the morning sun warmed her face. Daniel worked as usual but found himself glancing at Sarah more often than before. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that showed he was growing used to her presence. She brought a quiet calm to the ranch, something he didn't know he needed until she came. One evening, after a long day, they sat outside near the fence watching the sky turn orange. The field stretched out in front of them, glowing softly under the sunset. River grazed nearby, his figure peaceful against the warm colors of the sky. Sarah hugged her shawl around her. He loved sunsets too, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Michael always said, sunsets were the one moment the world seemed honest. Sarah smiled faintly. He said the same thing to me. I didn't think I'd hear those words again. Daniel looked at her gently. You don't have to forget him to heal. Sometimes loving someone means carrying their memory in a new way. Sarah stared at the sky, thinking deeply. When I lost him, I lost the world I knew. But being here, it's like a part of him is still alive. Daniel looked down at his hands. He wanted to come back. I didn't know that. And now I'll never know what he wanted to say. Sarah turned to him with soft eyes. Maybe he didn't need to say anything. Sometimes love speaks even after someone is gone. Her words settled inside Daniel like a warm truth. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them until this moment. Days slowly turned into weeks. Sarah began to help more around the ranch. She learned how to feed the horses properly, how to calm the younger ones, and how to understand River's gentle signals. She still carried sadness with her, but she also carried strength, the kind that grows from surviving something painful. Daniel started to open up too. He told her stories about Michael when they were boys, how they used to race barefoot across fields, how Michael always won because he laughed too hard to slow down. Sarah listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. Each story connected them more deeply, like two threads finally being woven into the same fabric. One cold morning, as they worked together in the stable, Sarah said something unexpected. Daniel. She hesitated, brushing hay off her hands. Do you ever think Michael would be happy seeing us here like this? Daniel paused, then nodded slowly. Yes. I think he would want us to help each other move forward. Sarah's eyes softened. I think so too. Over time, the grief they shared became something else, not a weight pulling them down, but a bridge bringing them closer. They didn't try to replace the past or erase it. Instead, they allowed it to guide them gently toward a quieter, kinder future. One evening, after finishing chores, Sarah walked toward River, placed her hand on his neck, and whispered something softly. Daniel was far enough away that he couldn't hear the words, but he saw the peace on her face. It wasn't the pain-filled whisper he had heard on that first night. It was something warm, something grateful. She turned toward Daniel and smiled a real smile, not the tired ones from before. I think, she said softly, I'm finally ready to stop running. Daniel felt something inside him ease. Then stay, he said. Stay as long as you want. Sarah nodded gently. I will. The stable doors creaked softly as the evening wind drifted in. River stood between them, calm and steady, as if he too felt the change in the air. Sarah stepped closer to Daniel. Not too close. Just enough to let him know she trusted him. Thank you, she whispered, for giving me a place to breathe again. Daniel looked at her with quiet warmth. Thank you for bringing back a part of my brother I thought I lost forever. The night settled peacefully around them. The stars appeared slowly, one by one, lighting up the dark sky. Sarah and Daniel stood side by side, not as strangers connected by grief, but as two people slowly learning how to rebuild their lives with patience, honesty, and the gentle reminder of a man they both loved in different ways. And somewhere deep inside the quiet stable, River let out a soft, calm breath as if he knew a broken world had finally begun to heal.